Have you ever imagined falling asleep on a stranger's shoulder and waking up in the middle of a mystery that would change your life forever? Jessica Walker just wanted to escape a nightmare, her baby clutched to her chest. But fate had much bigger plans. When she opened her eyes on that plane, she never expected that the man sitting next to her, cold and distant at first glance, was hiding a secret as shocking as it was dangerous. Who was this stranger willing to help a desperate woman he'd just met? And what chilling truth had he uncovered about her? What happened next will leave you speechless. If you believe a single encounter can change everything, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this incredible story with someone you love. So let's begin. Jessica Walker's life had become a silent nightmare she'd carried alone for months. Every day with Marcus, her ex-boyfriend, was a fight against the fear that grew inside her like a dark, creeping shadow. His hands, once tender, now left bruises on her pale skin, painful reminders that love had turned into a prison. The apartment that was supposed to be her safe haven had become a golden cage, where even one wrong word could trigger his rage. Emma's birth brought new light into her life, but also a new kind of terror. Jessica saw in her daughter's eyes the innocence she had lost, and the responsibility of protecting that tiny, fragile soul weighed on her like a mountain. Marcus was becoming more violent by the day, especially when Emma cried at night. Jessica knew it was only a matter of time before his anger would turn on the baby too. The nights were the worst. She'd lie awake listening to every sound, every movement he made, praying the alcohol would knock him out cold, so he wouldn't lash out at them again. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday, when Marcus came home early and found Emma crying in her crib. His shouting echoed through the apartment as he raged about that loud little brat and how Jessica was a useless mother. The sound of his hand slamming into the wall, just inches from the baby's face, was a cruel wake-up call. Right then, with Emma trembling in her arms, Jessica knew there was no going back. They had to leave that night, or they might never get another chance. The decision to run wasn't like in the movies. It wasn't planned or dramatic. It was raw, urgent, driven by a mother's primal instinct to protect her child. Jessica waited until Marcus passed out drunk on the couch. Then she grabbed a small bag with just the essentials for her and Emma, counted the $50 she'd been secretly saving for months, and walked out the front door without looking back. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the car keys, borrowed from an elderly neighbor who pretended not to notice the tears in her eyes when she asked for help. Chicago's airport felt like a maze of lights and sounds that only made her panic worse. Jessica had never flown before, never been that far from home. Surrounded by strangers, she felt like she was drowning in fear. Emma cried nonstop, as if she could feel her mother's desperation, and every curious glance from fellow passengers felt like silent judgment. Jessica had no plan, no real destination, just the cheapest one-way ticket she could find. Los Angeles, a city where she knew no one, but that held a whisper of hope, a chance to start over. As she stood in line to board, she kept looking over her shoulder, terrified Marcus had already found out she was gone. Every tall man that passed by made her heart stop. Every announcement over the loudspeakers sounded like a siren blaring in her ears. Guilt and fear battled inside her. Part of her wondered if she was doing the right thing, if she was being selfish for taking Emma away from her father, even if that father was a monster. But then she remembered the bruises, the yelling, the terror in her baby's eyes, and she knew there was no other way. The red-eye flight felt like it would last forever. Jessica had picked the latest one because it was the cheapest, but now she realized something deeper. The darkness outside mirrored the one inside her. She didn't know what kind of life was waiting on the other side of the country. She had no job, no family, nothing but a vague hope that somewhere, somehow, a better future was possible. The only thing she was sure of. Every mile that plane traveled was taking her farther from the hell she'd left behind. Emma finally fell asleep in her arms as the plane began to taxi down the runway, and Jessica felt a flicker of hope, tangled with exhaustion. She looked out the tiny window and watched the city lights disappear behind her, taking with them all the fear, the tears, the nightmares of the past few months. What she didn't know was that the man sitting beside her was about to change her life in ways she never could have imagined, and that her past was hiding secrets even she didn't know about. Sometimes, fate puts the right people in our path at exactly the right moment. And that night, 30,000 feet in the air, two broken souls were about to find out that salvation often comes in the most unexpected ways. Jessica Walker wore on her young face the invisible scars of someone who grew up learning that love could hurt. At just 22, she had endured more pain than most people experience in a lifetime. Yet her green eyes still held a flicker of hope, one that even the darkest moments hadn't managed to extinguish. Born into a working-class family in Detroit, Jessica always knew what it meant to stretch every dollar, to make a single bill last an entire week, and to chase a future that constantly slipped through her fingers like fine sand. Her childhood had been marked by the absence of her father, who walked out when she was only 5, leaving her mother, Linda, to raise 3 kids on her own. As the oldest, Jessica took on responsibilities far beyond her years, looking after her younger siblings while her mom worked 2 jobs, cooking meals, helping with homework, and learning way too early that she could only rely on herself. At 16, when her mother got sick, Jessica dropped out of school to work full-time as a waitress at a small neighborhood diner, giving up her dream of becoming a nurse to keep the family afloat. That's where she met Marcus, 3 years older, smooth-talking, sharply dressed, driving a shiny new car, and full of promises about the big life they could build together. To Jessica, he seemed like everything she'd ever wanted in a man. He made her feel special, chosen, like she was the most precious thing in the world, something she'd never felt before. He said he'd pull her out of that life of struggle, promised emotional and financial security, and for a little while Jessica really believed she'd found her Prince Charming in the middle of all her chaos. But Marcus's transformation from prince to monster was slow, almost unnoticeable at first. It began with little comments about her clothes, then came the digs about her friends, and soon after, the suggestions that she quit her job because his woman shouldn't be out there serving strangers. Tired of a lifetime of struggle and seduced by the idea of finally being taken care of, Jessica didn't realize she was trading her independence for a gilded cage. By the time she did, it was too late. She was isolated, financially dependent, and pregnant with Emma. Emma's birth awakened a strength Jessica never knew she had. The moment she held her daughter in the hospital, she felt a deep, primal connection that took her breath away. That tiny, perfect little human depended on her for everything, trusted her completely. And in that instant, Jessica swore she'd do anything to protect her. That's when she started seeing Marcus differently, not as her savior, but as a threat to their safety. And that realization sparked a fierce maternal instinct inside her, one she hadn't even known existed. In those early months of Emma's life, Jessica quietly began to stash away money. She saved pennies at the grocery store, secretly sold a few pieces of jewelry Marcus had given her, and even collected cans at the park when out with the baby. Every coin she managed to hide felt like planting a seed of hope in dry, cracked soil, slowly growing toward a future she couldn't yet picture, but somehow knew had to exist beyond the suffocating walls of their apartment. Jessica's courage didn't come from some big, movie-style moment of heroism. It was born from sheer exhaustion, from having nothing left to lose. She had tried talking to Marcus. She'd begged him to get help, even suggested couples therapy. But every conversation ended the same way, with her on the floor and him yelling about how ungrateful she was for everything he did. The last flicker of hope that he might change died the night she saw him raise his hand toward Emma. And in that moment, Jessica learned that a desperate mother can do anything. On that flight, holding Emma against her chest, Jessica felt like the bravest and the most terrified person in the world. She had burned all her bridges, left everything she knew behind, and leapt into the unknown with nothing but faith and grit. Her hands trembled not just from fear, but from something else too, a strange sense of excitement. For the first time in years, the future was hers to write. The page was blank, and even though she didn't know where to begin, it was hers. But what Jessica didn't know was that her story was far more complicated than she realized, and the past she thought she knew was hiding secrets that could change everything. As the plane sliced through the night sky toward Los Angeles, She was about to discover that sometimes life holds surprises that go far beyond even our boldest dreams. Life had taught Jessica that every little victory came with an even bigger setback, like the universe charged interest on every moment of happiness. Even before Marcus showed his true colors, she'd wrestled with the gnawing belief that she didn't deserve good things, an echo of the harsh words she'd heard growing up, telling her that people like us don't get to dream big. Every overdue bill felt like a cruel reminder of her reality. Every outfit she couldn't afford for herself or for Emma chipped away at her self-worth like stones weighing down her chest. One of Marcus's most subtle and devastating tactics was social isolation. Bit by bit, he pulled her away from the few friends she had, poisoning her mind with comments about how they were bad influences or just jealous of the perfect relationship they supposedly shared. Jessica watched her former co-workers become strangers. She lost touch with neighbors. Even her bond with her siblings grew strained when Marcus banned them from visiting. By the time she realized it, she was completely alone, just the way he wanted it. Money became another weapon, quiet, but deadly. Marcus controlled every penny that came into the house. He gave her just enough for the bare essentials and demanded receipts down to the last cent. Jessica felt humiliated every time she had to ask for money for diapers or baby meds. That financial dependency made her feel more trapped than any chain ever could. She'd lost her job, her independence, and with them, a crucial part of who she was. Motherhood, while the greatest joy of her life, came with a set of challenges no one had prepared her for. Emma was a fussy baby. She cried through the night, had frequent colic, and Jessica often felt helpless and unsure of herself as a mom. Her own mother wasn't around to give advice. She couldn't afford a private pediatrician, and even the most basic public health care depended on Marcus being in a good mood. The weight of keeping a child healthy and safe felt enormous, especially for someone who barely had the strength to care for herself. Sleep became a luxury she simply couldn't afford. Between Emma's needs at night and the constant vigilance required to keep up with Marcus's moods, Jessica lived in a permanent state of exhaustion. The deep circles under her eyes told the story of countless nights without rest, and the chronic fatigue made her feel decades older than she was. Every day became a battle against weariness, against despair, against that voice in her head whispering she wasn't strong enough for this life. The lack of professional prospects hung over her like a dark cloud. She had dropped out of school, had no experience beyond waitressing, and now, with a baby, her job options felt close to non-existent. Marcus never missed a chance to remind her that she was only good for housework, and his words echoed even when she dared to dream of something more. The sense that she was wasting her potential, that she could have been so much more, slowly ate away at her self-esteem. Her health began to suffer under the weight of it all. Jessica developed anxiety. She had silent panic attacks that left her breathless in the middle of the night, and her blood pressure started to spike dangerously. She couldn't seek proper medical care. Marcus said therapy was for the weak, and the over-the-counter pills she could afford barely numbed the symptoms. Her body was screaming for help after months of fear, stress, and neglect. But guilt was the cruelest of all. Jessica blamed herself for choosing Marcus, for falling for his lies, for putting Emma in that situation. She constantly second-guessed herself, wondering if she was being too dramatic, if she should just be grateful to have a roof over her head, even if it cost her dignity. Marcus's voice echoed in her mind, convincing her she was lucky to have someone who put up with her flaws, and that kind of emotional manipulation was harder to heal from than any bruise. Yet it was exactly that buildup of tiny torments that forged Jessica into something stronger than she ever thought possible. Every humiliation, every sleepless night, every desperate moment had been quietly feeding a strength deep within her. Like a diamond formed under crushing pressure, Jessica was being reshaped by her pain, preparing her for the boldest decision of her life. Jessica's first step toward freedom was so small it almost slipped past her unnoticed. It started on a Thursday afternoon when Emma finally fell asleep and she found herself alone in the quiet apartment, staring at her own reflection in the foggy bathroom mirror. The woman staring back had lifeless hair, dull eyes, and an expression of defeat that sent a chill down Jessica's spine. In that moment, a long silenced voice inside her whispered that this wasn't really who she was, that somewhere beneath all the fear and resignation, the real Jessica still existed. The one who dreamed of becoming a nurse, the one who laughed out loud, the one who believed in happy endings. Over the next few weeks, Jessica started making tiny changes, things that might have seemed insignificant to others, but to her, they were acts of quiet rebellion. She began collecting loose coins she found around the apartment, hiding them in a clean diaper at the back of Emma's drawer. When Marcus wasn't around, she'd turn on the radio low and hum along to songs she used to love, feeling like she was reconnecting with a piece of herself that had been buried alive. These moments were brief, and always haunted by the fear that he'd come home and catch her misbehaving, but still they were hers. Her first real attempt to seek help came when she finally worked up the nerve to call a domestic violence hotline. Her hands shook so badly she dialed the wrong number 3 times before she got it right. And when a gentle voice finally answered, Jessica went completely silent, listening only to her own ragged breathing. The woman on the other end was patient. She asked thoughtful questions, offered resources and shelters. But when it came time to make a concrete decision, Jessica panicked and hung up. She felt too exposed, too raw, too vulnerable to take that next step. For days afterward, Jessica lived in a fog of paranoia, convinced Marcus would somehow find out what she'd done. Every look he gave her felt loaded with suspicion. Every casual question about her day sounded like a police interrogation in her hyper-alert ears. She obsessively deleted the call from the phone's history, checked her notebooks for any stray notes she might have left behind, and spent sleepless nights imagining what he would do if he ever found out about her betrayal. The second attempt came weeks later, when she decided to talk to Marcus directly about trying couples therapy. She rehearsed the conversation over and over, carefully choosing her words, waiting for a moment when he seemed calm and open. When she finally gathered the courage, her voice trembled as she spoke about wanting them to be better. For Emma. About how maybe a professional could help them communicate. About how their love deserved a chance to grow in healthier soil. Marcus's reaction was worse than even her darkest predictions. He flew into a rage that made the walls shake, screaming about how she was calling him crazy, how she was trying to humiliate him, how she'd been brainwashed by those modern feminist ideas that only serve to break up families. The argument ended with Jessica on the kitchen floor, her lip bleeding, and the crushing realization that no change would ever come from him. If anything was going to change, it had to come from her and her alone. After that brutal confrontation, Jessica sank into a kind of numb despair, as if she'd used up every ounce of bravery in that one failed attempt. She stopped saving coins, stopped singing, stopped dreaming. For a few weeks, she moved like a ghost through her own life, just going through the motions to take care of Emma and keep up appearances. Meanwhile, Marcus became even more controlling, like he sensed she had tried to slip away and now needed to tighten the leash. But it was in the depths of that hopelessness that Jessica stumbled upon something that would change everything. While sorting through old papers that had belonged to her mother, she found a photograph of herself at 5 years old, beaming in the arms of her paternal grandmother, a woman she barely remembered. On the back of the photo was a handwritten note, a message suggesting the grandmother had left something for Jessica in a will she'd never known existed. That small clue from the past planted a seed of curiosity. Even if faint, it was enough to make her wonder what else she didn't know about her own story. Those failed attempts at change weren't wasted. They were rehearsals for the final act to come. Each failure taught her something new about her strength and her limits. Each heartbreak prepared her to recognize the moment when she'd finally be ready to act for real. Like a musician practicing scales before playing a symphony, Jessica had been unknowingly preparing for the most important performance of her life, and the stage was already being set. Her big moment was only weeks away. Her neighbor in the apartment next door, Mrs. Elena, was the first person in months to look at Jessica with real concern instead of judgment or indifference. A 67-year-old Mexican woman who had raised 6 kids on her own, Elena saw in Jessica's eyes the same silent desperation she'd once known in her own bones. She never asked direct questions about the bruises that sometimes appeared on Jessica's arms. Instead, she'd show up with an extra plate of food, offer to hold Emma while Jessica took a shower, or forget to grab her mail and ask Jessica to fetch it for her. It was Elena who showed up one particularly rough afternoon, when Emma was sick and crying nonstop. She brought chamomile tea, held the baby close, and softly hummed lullabies in Spanish until Emma finally drifted off. Jessica broke down in tears, not just from relief but from the almost forgotten feeling of being cared for, without expectation or strings attached. Elena didn't give advice. She didn't lecture. She just showed up, offering a hand when Jessica needed it most, a quiet lighthouse in the middle of her storm. Dr. Martinez, the pediatrician at the public clinic, became another unexpected lifeline. During Emma's checkups, he noticed the subtle signs of trauma and stress, how Jessica flinched at sudden sounds, avoided eye contact, how her hands trembled when filling out forms. Instead of brushing it off like so many others had, Dr. Martinez started spending a few extra minutes at the end of each visit to ask how Jessica was doing, if she needed anything, if she had support at home. Even Mrs. Johnson, the pharmacist on the corner, a warm, sharp-eyed black woman in her 50s, quietly joined Jessica's invisible safety net. She noticed how Jessica always bought the same basic painkillers and bruise ointments, and began gently recommending stronger products. Sometimes she'd forget to charge for the extra items she slipped into the bag. When Jessica seemed extra anxious or in a rush, Mrs. Johnson would slow her down with casual conversation, as if she knew those extra few minutes away from home mattered more than anyone realized. But the most surprising connection came through an online support group for single moms that Jessica stumbled upon one night during a rare, unsupervised moment on Marcus's computer. She created a fake profile and began reading post after post from women who had lived through stories just like hers. For the first time, she didn't feel so alone. These women didn't just share their pain, they shared survival tactics, little victories, proof that life could go on, and even get better. One of them, who went by the username Phoenix Rising, became a sort of virtual mentor. Through carefully deleted private messages, Phoenix told Jessica about her own escape from abuse and how she rebuilt her life from scratch with 2 kids in tow. She never pushed Jessica to act before she was ready. Instead, she gently planted seeds. She shared shelter numbers, support hotlines, and most importantly, kept reminding Jessica that she was stronger than she realized, and that she deserved a life without fear. Strangely enough, Emma, too, became a source of strength and connection. In her darkest moments, when hope felt like it was slipping away completely, Jessica would look into her daughter's trusting eyes and remember why she couldn't give up. Emma didn't just need her. Emma believed in her. She smiled at her, found joy in the smallest gestures of love. That bond, pure and unconditional, reminded Jessica that real love still existed, and she was still capable of giving it and receiving it. Donna Rosa, the elderly seamstress in the neighborhood, added another thread to the fabric of Jessica's quiet comeback. A 75-year-old Italian widow who had raised 4 children alone after losing her husband in the war, she offered Jessica some under-the-table sewing work from home. The pay was low, but it meant everything. It meant independence, purpose, proof that Jessica still had valuable skills and something to offer the world. Rosa never asked why Jessica needed the work kept quiet. She just smiled and said, "A woman who works with her hands always finds a way to survive." These small, scattered connections wove together into an invisible support network Jessica didn't even realize was forming around her. Each kind gesture, every word of encouragement, every moment of quiet understanding soaked into her soul like rain on dry earth, preparing the ground for the courage that would soon bloom when the time finally came to leave. The night that changed everything started just like so many others, with the familiar sound of Marcus's key turning in the lock at 2 a.m., followed by the heavy, staggering shuffle of his footsteps down the hallway. Jessica was lying in bed, pretending to be asleep, with Emma curled up beside her when she heard something shatter in the kitchen and a string of curse words that made her blood run cold. She knew the signs. He'd clearly drunk more than usual, and nights like that always ended badly. But this time things were even more fragile. Emma was going through a rough phase, waking every 2 hours with colic that left her screaming inconsolably. As if fate was testing her limits, Emma started crying the very moment Marcus entered the bedroom reeking of booze and cigarette smoke. His eyes were glassy, bloodshot with rage and liquor, and Jessica felt the air drain from her lungs when he marched straight toward the crib with dangerous, deliberate steps. "That damn kid won't shut up," he roared, his voice ripping through the apartment like an animal's growl. Jessica jumped up on instinct, placing herself between him and the crib, but he shoved her so hard she hit the wall behind her with a thud. What happened next etched itself into Jessica's memory like a slow-motion nightmare, every detail vivid, terrifying. Marcus reached for Emma, and for the first time in their abusive relationship, Jessica saw something in his eyes that chilled her to the bone, rage aimed not at her but at the baby. "I'll teach that brat to shut up once and for all," he snarled. And in that split second, Jessica saw the truth with brutal clarity. She wasn't just living with a violent man, she was facing someone capable of hurting an innocent child. A maternal instinct that had been buried under months of fear exploded like a volcano. She threw herself between Marcus and the crib with a strength she didn't know she had, taking a punch to the face that made her see stars, but standing her ground like a human shield. "You're not touching her," she screamed, and her voice came out with a force that even surprised her. Marcus froze, stunned, not by her physical strength but by the look in her eyes. The terrified, submissive woman he had spent so long molding was gone. In her place stood a lioness, wild and fierce, ready to defend her cub. For a few long seconds they stared at each other in a silent, primal standoff. Marcus's second move was even more violent. He grabbed Jessica by the hair and yanked her away from the crib while she kicked and scratched like a woman possessed, screaming, doing anything she could to stop him from reaching Emma. The struggle was brutal and uneven. Marcus was physically stronger by far, but Jessica fought with the desperation of a mother who knew this was the most important fight of her life. When he finally pinned her to the floor, his hands tightening around her throat, Jessica had a chilling realization. She was going to die, and Emma would be left alone with a monster. It wasn't the pain or the fear for her own life that gave her the strength to fight back. It was the image of Emma growing up under Marcus's control that ignited something primal. With one final desperate burst of energy, she reached for the bedside lamp and smashed it into Marcus's head. He staggered backward, stunned, blood starting to drip from a cut on his forehead. For a few crucial seconds he just stood there, dazed. Jessica didn't waste them. She grabbed Emma from the crib and locked herself in the bathroom, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. From the other side of the door she could hear Marcus screaming threats, ugly, specific, and terrifying. He shouted about what he'd do to her when he got his hands on her again. Swore she'd never see Emma if she tried to leave. Promised he'd track her down no matter where she ran. But something had shifted inside Jessica during that fight. She had proven to herself that she could fight back, that she could protect her child. And more than anything, she now knew this. She'd rather die trying to escape than spend one more day in that living hell. The woman who entered that bathroom wasn't the same one who walked out an hour later. When Marcus finally passed out on the couch, knocked out by booze and the weight of his own violence, Jessica stayed awake until dawn, holding Emma against her chest and making the most important decision of her life. She didn't have a detailed plan. She didn't know exactly how she was going to do it, but one thing was clear. They were getting out that day, no matter what it took. The breaking point had been reached, and there was no turning back. It was time to choose, between the familiar prison or the terrifying uncertainty of freedom. As the sun rose outside the tiny bathroom window, Jessica felt something she hadn't felt in months, hope mixed with determination. She had discovered that she was stronger than she thought, braver than she believed, and more capable of protecting her daughter than Marcus could ever break. The woman who had hidden for so long was finally ready to fight for the life they both deserved, and nothing could stop her now. The first hour after making that decision was the hardest of Jessica's life. Her hands shook so badly she could barely fold Emma's clothes to pack them into the small suitcase. Every snore from Marcus on the couch made her freeze, terrified he'd wake up and discover her escape plan. She moved like a shadow through the apartment, taking only the essentials: some clothes, a few important documents, the small stash of hidden money, and Emma's favorite stuffed bear. Every item she left behind felt like a little death, but she knew she was taking the only thing that mattered: a chance at freedom. The walk to Mrs. Elena's door, just 100 meters away, felt like the longest walk of her life. Carrying Emma and the small suitcase, Jessica kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting Marcus to come storming after them. When she finally knocked at 6 in the morning, her face bruised and streaked with tears, Elena didn't ask a single question. She simply opened her arms, pulled them both inside, and whispered words of comfort in Spanish. Words Jessica didn't understand, but that soothed her soul more deeply than anything she'd heard in months. Mrs. Elena turned out to be an angel disguised as a neighbor. Not only did she offer her home as a safe haven, but she also called her niece who worked at a travel agency and managed to book a last-minute flight to Los Angeles, the farthest city Jessica could afford with the cash she had. During the 2 hours they spent waiting for the airport departure time, Elena shared her own story of escaping an abusive husband 40 years earlier. Her words planted seeds of courage in Jessica's trembling heart. "Mija," she said, gently cupping Jessica's bruised face in her calloused hands. "You're stronger than you think. Life's giving you a second chance. Don't waste it on fear." The ride to the airport was an emotional roller coaster. Jessica felt euphoric for finally taking a stand, and terrified by the weight of the decision she'd made. Emma, sensing her mother's tension, cried more than usual. Jessica found herself softly humming lullabies her own mother used to sing to her as a child. Those small moments of connection reminded her why she was doing this. This wasn't just an escape, it was a declaration of war against everything that had tried to destroy them. Chicago's airport presented a whole new set of challenges. Jessica had never flown before, didn't know how the security process worked, and felt lost in a sea of people who all seemed to know exactly where they were going. Every loudspeaker announcement made her jump. Every tall man who passed by made her heart race with fear that it might be Marcus. When she finally checked in and made it through security, it felt like she'd climbed a mountain. A small one, maybe, but still, a victory for someone who hadn't made a single decision on her own in months. The boarding area became a place of reluctant reflection. Sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair, Emma asleep in her arms, Jessica stared out the large window at planes taking off, carrying people to destinations and adventures she couldn't even imagine. For the first time in months, she let herself dream. Not of grand futures or fairy tales, just small things, waking up without fear, making her own choices, raising Emma in a place where laughter came more often than tears. During the 3-hour wait, Jessica went through all the stages of grieving the life she was leaving behind. There was regret, wondering if she was being too dramatic, if Marcus deserved another chance, if she should have tried to talk one more time. Then came the anger, at Marcus for shattering her dreams, at herself for letting it happen, at the world for being so cruel to people who only wanted to be happy. But finally, there was acceptance. And with it came a strange, comforting peace. Boarding time felt like a ritual, like crossing into another world. Jessica held Emma a little tighter, took a deep breath, and walked toward the gate like a woman walking into a brand new life. Because that's exactly what she was doing. Each step carried her farther from Marcus, farther from fear, farther from the broken version of herself she had learned to live with. When she finally sat down in her narrow airplane seat, next to a man in a suit too absorbed in his own world to notice her, Jessica closed her eyes and made a silent promise. To Emma and to herself. No matter what the future brings, we'll face it together. As a team. As a real family. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Jessica's stomach twisted, not just from the motion but from the realization that there really was no going back. In just a few hours she'd be on the other side of the country. No job, no home, just $50 and a fierce determination to build a better life for her daughter. It was terrifying, and it was freeing, like leaping off a cliff with no idea what waited below, but trusting that whatever was down there had to be better than the slow, painful fall she'd been enduring until now. The flight had only been in the air for about an hour, when Emma woke from her restless nap and started crying, with a force that turned every nearby passenger's head. Irritated glances were barely concealed. Jessica's cheeks burned with shame as she tried to soothe her daughter, gently rocking her and whispering soft words that did nothing to stop the cries. Emma's wails echoed through the cabin like a siren, and Jessica could feel the weight of judgmental stares pressing down on her. silent accusations that tightened the knot in her chest. It was as if all the stress from the past months was being poured out through her baby's tiny lungs. The man seated beside her, who had remained in complete silence until then, shifted slightly in her direction. Jessica braced herself for a sarcastic comment or an annoyed complaint about the noise. But when her eyes met his, she saw something entirely unexpected. Genuine understanding, mixed with a kind of concern that went far deeper than a passenger's simple frustration. "She has colic?" Ryan asked in a surprisingly gentle voice. Jessica was so taken aback by the kindness in his tone that she forgot to answer at first, simply nodding while still trying to calm Emma. Then Ryan did something that left Jessica completely stunned. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a small musical toy, a hand-painted wooden horse that played a soft tune when a tiny crank was turned. "My sister used to say this worked wonders with my nephew," he explained, offering the toy with a careful motion. The delicate melody seemed to hypnotize Emma instantly, her sobs slowing, then fading into quiet curiosity. Jessica looked at Ryan with a gratitude that words couldn't express. But something in his eyes caught her off guard. An odd familiarity, as if he somehow knew her from another time. Over the next 2 hours, an unusual sense of intimacy formed between the two strangers. Ryan didn't ask invasive questions about Jessica's clearly shaken state, but his presence was comforting in a way she couldn't explain. When Emma finally fell asleep, lulled by the gentle motion of the plane and the looping melody of the little toy, Jessica felt a wave of deep exhaustion wash over her. Months of sleepless nights, weeks of constant fear, and the whirlwind of the past 24 hours caught up to her. Eventually, her head rested on the shoulder of the kind stranger, and she slipped into a deep, dreamless sleep, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. And it was during that sleep that Ryan did something that would change everything. Quietly, discreetly, he took a photo of Jessica's reflection in the airplane window and sent it to his team at a private investigation firm, a company that operated as a front for his secret philanthropic work. It wasn't curiosity or invasion of privacy that drove him, it was instinct. Years of helping people in desperate situations had sharpened his senses. The bruises on Jessica's wrist, the way she jumped at sudden noises, the fear in her eyes. Her story was one he recognized all too well. And he'd learned that sometimes, truly helping someone meant knowing more about them than they could say out loud. The reply from his team arrived before the plane even landed, and what Ryan read on his phone left him stunned. Jessica Walker wasn't just a young mother fleeing an abusive relationship. She was the long-lost heiress to a $15 million fortune left by Margaret Walker, an eccentric great-aunt who had passed away 3 years earlier. The will had been contested by distant relatives, but Margaret had been very clear. The inheritance was to go to Jessica Marie Walker, daughter of Linda Walker, born in Detroit on March 15, 2002. The problem? No one had been able to find her. She'd changed her name after moving in with Marcus and disappeared completely from the family's radar. But what Ryan discovered next was even more disturbing. Marcus Coleman wasn't just an abusive partner. He had learned about Jessica's inheritance through a cousin who worked at a law firm. Their entire relationship had been a calculated trap to keep her under control until he could figure out how to access the money. Investigators found forged documents, tampered records, even bribed officials. Everything designed to keep Jessica legally unreachable, while Marcus plotted to marry her and claim her inheritance through spousal rights. The most jaw-dropping twist, though, was still ahead. Ryan found out he had a connection to Jessica he never expected. Margaret Walker had been a client of his father, a lawyer who specialized in estate law, and Ryan vaguely remembered meeting Jessica when they were kids, during a visit Margaret made to the office years ago. She had been the shy little girl with curly hair who hid behind her great-aunt's skirt, and he was the smug teenager who offered her a sandwich when he realized she was hungry. The toy horse that soothed Emma? That had been a gift from Margaret that very same day. She'd told him, "One day you'll know the right moment to pass this on." When Jessica stirred as the plane began its descent, she found Ryan watching her with an expression that startled her. A blend of protectiveness, purpose, and something that almost felt like recognition. He held a stack of printed papers she hadn't seen before she'd fallen asleep, and the intensity in his gaze made her feel like he knew things about her, Even she didn't know. Jessica, he said softly, using her name for the first time, though she was sure she hadn't told him. We need to talk when we land. There's something I found out, something that's going to change everything, and there are people you need to stay away from. The plane touched down in Los Angeles with Jessica wide awake, her heart racing, not just from the landing, but from the sense that her desperate escape had turned into something far bigger and more complicated than she ever imagined. The man beside her wasn't just a kind stranger. He was a missing piece in a story she didn't even know she was part of. And the next few hours were about to reveal truths that would completely reshape her identity. But the second the plane touched the runway, Jessica noticed something strange. Ryan, who had remained calm and steady throughout the flight, suddenly looked tense. His eyes were locked on something outside the window, two men in suits standing at the gate. Jessica's stomach twisted. Don't worry, Ryan said under his breath. They're here for you, to make sure no one else gets close. It was meant to reassure her, but her heart only beat faster. On the way to the limousine, Jessica could feel the security guard's eyes on her, tracking every step. Emma was asleep in her arms, blissfully unaware of the tension crackling around them. Jessica couldn't stop scanning the crowd, half expecting Marcus to appear at any moment. Ryan walked beside her calmly, but his entire posture had shifted. He was alert, ready, as if he knew something was coming. And he was right. When they entered the car, Jessica saw the envelope. It was sitting on the seat, her name written in shaky handwriting. An envelope neither of them had placed there. The color drained from her face. She looked at Ryan in panic. Was it him? She whispered. Ryan picked up the envelope carefully and read the note inside. His jaw clenched tight. He knows you're here, Ryan said. And he made it very clear he's not going to stop. The message was short, cruel. Marcus had written that the city was big, but he had time, that Jessica could run, but someone would always be watching. And if she dared touch the money before he got his share, there'd be consequences. Jessica felt the world tilt under her feet. She'd thought the landing marked the beginning of her new life, but the nightmare was still chasing her, a shadow that refused to disappear. Don't panic, Ryan said. This note was left before we arrived. He doesn't know that I know everything, and he doesn't know you're not alone anymore. He tucked the letter away and made a call, giving short, precise instructions. But Jessica couldn't stop trembling. She was so tired of running. And for the first time, what she felt wasn't fear. It was anger. The urge to stop hiding, to take control, to end this on her own terms. At Ryan's apartment, Jessica locked herself in the bathroom and finally broke down. Not from despair, but from the weight of everything she'd been holding back. The cold tile floor, the marble sink, the locked door, all symbols of a new life that still felt too fragile against the force of the past. But then she heard Emma's laugh. The baby was awake, giggling in Ryan's arms, clutching the wooden horse like it was magic. And something shifted. Jessica stepped out with her face washed and her eyes clear. Tell me everything, she said. I want to know who I am. I want to know what he did. And I want to know how to end this. Ryan nodded. They sat at the table, spreading out the documents, her inheritance, Marcus's scheme, the forged records, everything laid out, black and white. Jessica read slowly, carefully, as if studying the map of her stolen past. But the hardest moment came when she saw the photo. Marcus at a hotel in LA just the day before. He was close. This was no longer a game. For a second, Jessica felt the urge to run again. But this time, she didn't. She held Emma with one arm and signed the papers with the other. Ryan said nothing. He just watched, quiet, respectful. Jessica didn't need saving anymore. She had made her choice. And the fight would start that very night. An anonymous tip came into Ryan's phone. Marcus had slipped up. A mistake, small but enough to open a case. Jessica looked at Ryan, fear and adrenaline swirling in her chest. Is it time? She asked. He answered with just a look. The confrontation had begun. The morning after the anonymous call, Jessica woke before sunrise. It wasn't Emma's crying that stirred her, but something deeper. A pulse in her chest, an urgency she couldn't ignore. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel frozen. She felt focused. She moved quietly, tucked the blanket around Emma, and looked out from the penthouse window. The city still seemed asleep, but she was wide awake and ready. Ryan was already in the living room, suit on, coffee in hand like he hadn't slept at all. His tired eyes softened when he saw her. The contact confirmed. Marcus was seen trying to open a fake account in your mother's name. Used a forged ID. We've got the footage, we've got witnesses, and we've got you ready to fight. Jessica sat down, mind still spinning. But for the first time, she wasn't the one who had to prove she was telling the truth. Now Marcus would have to answer for every lie. With legal support, Jessica recorded her statement. Calm, steady, unwavering. She told everything. The abuse, the manipulation, the escape, the note in the car, the veiled threats. When the camera finally shut off, the room was silent. She wasn't just a woman who had been broken. She was a woman who had rebuilt herself piece by piece. Ryan looked at her and simply said, "This isn't just a statement. It's a manifesto. You changed your fate, Jess." While the case moved forward, Jessica allowed herself something new. To breathe. One quiet afternoon, while Emma played on the living room rug, Jessica caught herself smiling. Just because. She was starting to feel lighter. Not because she'd forgotten the pain, but because she was no longer defined by it. She began sorting through her documents, reclaimed her birth name, and with Ryan's help, opened a bank account in her own name. Her access to the inheritance was restored. But the money? That was just a symbol. Freedom was the real prize. Jessica rented a small house with a garden on a peaceful street. She wanted Emma to grow up hearing birds, not sirens. She painted the walls in soft colors, planted daisies by the front steps, and decorated her daughter's room with her own hands. It wasn't luxury. It was a new beginning. And every time she watched Emma run barefoot across the backyard, her heart synced with time itself, as if finally everything was where it belonged. Going back to school still felt far off, but she started small. She enrolled in an online course about childcare, then another on basic first aid. At night when Emma was asleep, Jessica would sit with a warm mug of tea, her feet under a blanket, reading in silence. A silence that used to feel threatening, but now felt like peace. The old dream of becoming a nurse slowly started beating again inside her, and this time she believed it was possible. Ryan came around often, but never imposed. Sometimes he'd just bring food and sit quietly in the yard watching Emma play. Other times he and Jessica talked about everything, and also about nothing. The bond between them wasn't built on promises, but presence. Jessica didn't need saving anymore, but she was learning that allowing companionship didn't mean giving up her independence. The transformation wasn't sudden, and it wasn't linear. Jessica still woke up from nightmares, still had moments when the past crept in like a shadow. But now, she knew how to push it back. She had tools. She had people. And most importantly, she had herself, stronger, calmer, whole, and no one could take that from her. Then, on what felt like an ordinary morning, the phone rang. They found Marcus. He tried to flee the state. He's in custody. Trial is coming. Jessica hung up without saying a word. She looked out the window. Emma was watering the flowers that had just begun to bloom. Jessica took a deep breath. The final battle was coming, and she wasn't planning to run. The courtroom was cold. Not from the AC, but from the weight of stairs, the stiff protocol, the endless waiting. Jessica sat in the second row, hands folded in her lap, eyes focused ahead. Emma stayed home with a trusted sitter. It was the preliminary hearing, and Marcus would finally hear her voice in public. This time she wouldn't be begging. She'd be telling the truth, and that was enough. When he entered, escorted by officers, Jessica didn't feel afraid. Not anymore. She felt pity. The man standing there wasn't the giant who used to haunt her nights. He was just a coward trying to play a system that no longer protected him. Marcus looked away when he saw her. And to Jessica, that was the beginning of justice. She stood when her name was called, walked to the witness stand without trembling, and in front of everyone, She told her story with the voice of someone who no longer carried shame, only strength. Her testimony lasted under 20 minutes, but each word carried years of silenced pain. Jessica didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask for sympathy. She simply told the truth. When she finished, the judge paused for a long moment before thanking her for her clarity. The session ended with a trial date set for 3 months later. Walking out, Jessica felt the sun on her face like a gift, as if the universe whispered, "You beat yourself, and that's everything." Back at home, she found Emma asleep on the couch, clutching the little wooden horse. Jessica sat beside her, gently stroking her hair with quiet tenderness. That night, she wrote the final chapter of her restart journal. One line read, "The past shaped me, but it doesn't define me. If I ever feel fear again, I'll remember the woman I was in that courtroom, and I'll keep going. Always forward." A short time later, Ryan invited her to a quiet event at a local women's support center. Jessica almost declined. She didn't feel ready to speak publicly about her pain. But then she thought about the hundreds of messages she had received, from women waiting for a voice to tell them it was possible to survive. So she walked onto that stage, Emma in her arms, and shared her story. For the first time, not as a victim, but as a bridge. The audience cried, applauded, rose to their feet. And one woman in the front row said, "You just saved my life." Jessica hugged the stranger like an old friend, because in a way, she was. She was Jessica, just a few months ago. And in that embrace, something closed. Pain had become purpose. The fall had become a voice. And her story was now a lighthouse for others still lost at sea. The trial happened quietly. Marcus was found guilty of fraud, threats, and domestic violence. He was sentenced to 8 years. Jessica didn't celebrate. She didn't need to. She had already won. Her name was cleared. Her inheritance restored. But the real treasure she received was invisible. Peace. And with it, a brand new start. She enrolled in psychology classes with a focus on trauma. She wanted to understand what had healed her, and maybe help others find their way too. One night, while putting Emma to bed, her daughter whispered, "Mommy, I love it when you smile like that. You look light." Jessica smiled even more, because it was true. The smile wasn't a mask anymore. It came from within, from a place that used to be filled with darkness. Now there was a garden, soap bubbles, quiet nights, and love. Safe love, steady love. Love she'd learned to give herself, before anyone else. Have you ever helped someone when they needed it most? Or been helped yourself in a moment of crisis? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more powerful stories like this one. Because sometimes all someone needs is to know they're not alone.